Alien girl stunned. Human males don't eat their partners after mating season? Eric Moran stirred awake as the pale glow of station morning seeped through the thin curtains of his modest apartment. The faint hum of Nexus Station's life support a constant in the background. His muscles stretched with the practiced ease of a man who'd spent years in the service, the old discipline never truly leaving him. And as he sat up, the smell of something sweet and unfamiliar drifted into his senses. He rubbed a hand through his unruly blonde hair, grinning faintly as he thought of Jira, the crimson-skinned alien who changed his life in ways he still couldn't fully process. Padding barefoot into the kitchen, in nothing but his black tactical pants, he expected to find her humming silver-white hair catching the light, maybe bent over some concoction of hers that he'd pretend to understand. Instead, the sharp clatter of metal snapped him to alertness, instincts snapping tight like coiled steel. There she was, not serene, not mischievous, but trembling, her usually vibrant red skin flushed pale pink, eyes wide, chest rising and falling in frantic rhythm. In her hand, gripped so tightly the knuckles trembled, was a kitchen knife pointed straight at him. Eric froze mid-step, hands raising instinctively to show his empty palms. "Whoa, Jira, what the hell?" he said, trying to keep his voice calm, though the soldier in him was already calculating distances, angles, disarmament options. Her melodic voice came out strained, ragged with fear. "Stay back. I know what comes next." He blinked, baffled, trying to process. "Next? You mean breakfast? Coffee?" "I was thinking maybe—" Her voice broke like glass. "Don't patronize me. I know your species' customs. I researched Earth. I know what happens when the female doesn't conceive after the first night." His brow furrowed, confusion painting his face. "When she doesn't what?" Her hand shook harder, but her grip didn't falter, the knife gleaming. "You're going to eat me," she blurted, the words spilling out like poison. "That's what human males do, isn't it? When mating fails, you consume the female to reclaim the energy." For a long, frozen heartbeat, Eric just stared at her, mind scrambling, and then, despite the genuine terror on her face, despite the knife that could open his chest if she panicked, he burst into laughter. It was sudden, unstoppable, the deep, rolling kind that bent him double, his bare torso shaking. "Oh, holy Jira, no," he gasped, tears starting in his eyes. "Humans don't God. We don't eat each other after sex. Ever. That's not a thing." Her grip faltered, uncertainty creeping past the terror, though her eyes narrowed in offense. "This isn't funny," she cried, the knife lowering only an inch. "I saw the documentary mantises, spiders' females consuming males. I thought humans, being larger, reversed it." Eric wiped at his eyes, trying to breathe through laughter that still kept bubbling out. "Sweetheart, we're not mantises. We don't have mating meals, okay? The only eating I was planning was breakfast, the normal kind. Food from the fridge." She hesitated, knife trembling. Then her voice dropped to a whisper, heavy with shame. "But on my world, if the female doesn't conceive, the male's hunger becomes unbearable. He has the right to consume her. It's honorable." His laughter died in his throat, the absurdity giving way to the weight of what she was admitting. "Jesus," he breathed, understanding dawning. No wonder she'd been terrified. "So that's why you grabbed the knife. You thought—" She nodded quickly, as though afraid he'd still lunge for her. Slowly, deliberately, she set the knife down on the counter with a faint clink, her shoulders sagging as though a mountain had slid from them, but embarrassment flushed her cheeks deeper crimson. "I feel foolish," she murmured, avoiding his eyes. Eric stepped closer, carefully, taking her shaking hands into his calloused ones. "Don't. How could you have known? You only had your people's frame of reference. I'm just glad you didn't stab me before I had the chance to explain." A shaky smile ghosted across her lips. the knife forgotten between them. "I would have made it quick at least," she teased weakly, her voice carrying a mix of relief and mortification. Eric grinned, tugging her against his chest, feeling her finally relax into his warmth. "How considerate," he murmured. They laughed together, but beneath the shared relief lingered something heavier, an unspoken truth that their bond had to fight not just distance and difference, but entire worlds of expectation and fear. And though the morning eased into smiles again, Eric knew this was only the beginning of what they'd have to learn about each other. The cosmic crossroads was alive with neon light and alien voices when Eric stepped through its doors that evening, Jira's hand warm in his own. The crowd a swirl of species from across the quadrant sipping glowing drinks under holographic constellations drifting overhead. He tugged at the collar of his shirt, feeling exposed as her silver dress clung to her curves and drew glances from strangers. But she only squeezed his hand reassuringly and led him toward a booth where her friends waited. A collection of beings so diverse. Eric nearly forgot his own nerves. Mera the Aquilian with her rippling tendrils that pulsed with curiosity. Crix the insectal Vesperian clicking with questions about human mating. Ta the scaled draconian eyeing him as if he were a puzzle. And a stone-skinned colossus whose rumbling laugh filled the air each of them. Fascinated by the novelty of a human who had chosen a Xandorian, and more importantly, hadn't consumed her. The questions came fast, some blunt to the point of absurdity. "You mate for pleasure without conception? What ensures your genetic loyalty?" And Eric answered with a dry mix of honesty and humor, explaining words like trust, choice, companionship, even as he realized how radical those concepts sounded to them, their murmurs like ripples across water. The idea of love without biology, a curiosity bordering on heresy. Jira sat tall beside him, pride shimmering in her crimson cheeks, her fingers intertwined with his under the table, and for a moment, Eric felt accepted, a little less like the oddity everyone whispered about, until the air shifted, the booth's laughter dying as a tall, dark-skinned Xandorian male with tattoos winding down his muscular arms approached. His burgundy gaze locked on Jira with predatory intensity. Eric didn't need her sharp intake of breath to know this was Drax, the suitor she had rejected, and the way the crowd hushed told him this confrontation was anything but prodded. The weight of centuries of custom pressing down as Drax growled her name and accused her of dishonoring their people by lying with prey. His words spat with venom, and Eric, heart pounding, realized the morning's knife misunderstanding had only been the first taste of what it meant to love across the Yoi, gulf of species tradition. The tension inside the cosmic crossroads thickened until the air itself seemed to vibrate with it. Drax towering over the booth like a living storm cloud, his tattooed arms folded across his chest and his deep crimson skin pulsing with heat that betrayed his agitation. The surrounding crowd leaning in with barely concealed hunger for the spectacle about to unfold. Eric rose slowly, every instinct from his years in the corps warning him not to show weakness. But he kept his expression neutral, one hand still brushing against Jira's for reassurance, even as he locked eyes with the larger Xandorian, refusing to drop his gaze. And when Drax growled that she had denied him his rightful consumption by choosing a human mate, Eric's stomach lurched with a mix of disgust and fury, but he forced his voice calm, measured, as he said evenly, "With all due respect, buddy, on my world we don't devour people when things don't work out," earning a ripple of shocked amusement from the alien onlookers. But his words were tender, and Drax's nostrils flared as his voice thundered across the bar, invoking tradition, demanding that the honor of Xander be upheld through trial. And when Jira stood, chin high and voice sharp, declaring that if there must be a contest, she would name it, Eric's pulse hammered, uncertain what she would choose, until her words fell with the weight of a gavel. The trial of restraint, and a collective gasp rippled through the assembly. For this was no simple duel of strength or blades, but a crucible of willpower where instincts were, sharpened to razors and failure meant more than Humiliation, it meant succumbing to one's most primal urges in front of witnesses. Drax sneered, trying to mask the flicker of doubt that crossed his face. For this was a test most dreaded by males of his kind. Their hunger turned against them, but he accepted with booming bravado, pounding a fist to his chest, as if to claim the challenge had been his idea all along, while Eric blinked, struggling to piece together what he had just been volunteered for, until Jira leaned close, whispering urgently that this was the one arena where humans had a chance, because it demanded not strength, but control. A discipline bred into Eric's bones through years of training where ignoring pain, fatigue, and temptation had meant survival. The bartender with 3 arms appeared then, bearing a tray with 2 small vials of liquid that shimmered like molten gems. And as it announced the rules each contestant would drink, the pheromonal stimulant would ignite their most consuming desires, and the first to act upon them, whether aggression or lust, would be declared unworthy. The circle of spectators widened, bets flowing into neural links, the murmur of excitement building like the charge before a storm. And Eric caught Jira's anxious gaze, her hand brushing his once more, silent faith passing between them before he nodded grimly, taking the vial. At the barkeep's mark, he swallowed, the taste a bizarre fusion of cinnamon and ozone, a crackle of fire spreading down his throat into his veins, his heartbeat accelerating as if a switch had been thrown, every nerve sparking alive, every sense magnified, until the faint hum of the lights overhead sounded like a symphony, and the scent of Jira Sharp, sweet, alien, hit him like a physical blow that nearly buckled his knees, desire clawing at him with savage intensity. Across the circle Drax trembled, pupils blown wide, his massive frame shuddering as his own biology screamed at him to take, to claim, to consume. Yet the rules of the trial forbade it, and so they stood, eyes locked on Jira as the measure of their will played out in silence that throbbed heavier than combat. Eric ground his teeth, forcing his breathing into the old rhythm drilled into him in the core's inhale, hold, exhale, clinging to discipline like a lifeline, remembering nights on deployment where hunger, exhaustion, and fear had all screamed louder than reason but had been mastered through choice, through the sheer stubborn refusal to yield. And he drew on that memory now, sweat slicking his skin as he stared straight ahead, refusing to move even as every fiber of his body demanded. He lunged toward the woman who was, simultaneously, his salvation and his torment. Minutes stretched like hours, the crowd restless but entranced, whispering disbelief as the human remained steady while the mighty Xandorian began to crack, his breath ragged, his hands flexing and curling into claws. And then, out of the corner of his eye, Eric caught something aflicker at the edge of the crowd, a server droid approaching with a tray of drinks it had no business carrying, its optic sensors flickering irregularly, the cadence of its announcement too smooth, too rehearsed, and suspicion surged through him, security instincts kicking into overdrive as he recognized the signs of tampering, of sabotage. The droid insisted the contestants hydrate under health code A47B, but Eric's training screamed at him that no such regulation existed, and when he glanced at Jira, her lips parted in sudden alarm. He knew his instincts were right. Then Mara's tendrils whipped out, coiling around one of the glasses and bringing it close to her sensory nodes, and her voice rang with outrage as she declared the liquid tainted with pheromone inhibitors and chemical spikes designed to unbalance the contest, to weaken the human while shielding the Xandorian, and the crowd erupted in cries of scandal. For cheating in a formal trial was an offense bordering on sacrilege. Eric's gut twisted with fury, his eyes snapping to Drax, who snarled denial, but whose brother Vorn had already begun slipping toward the exit, only to be intercepted by security drones swooping down to pin him in a containment field, his guilt clear as day. The bartender's voice boomed that interference meant forfeit, but Eric, chest heaving with adrenaline, shook his head and barked that the challenge would continue, because he refused to win by default, because the point of this was not loopholes or technicalities, but the truth of choice, of will. And though the stimulant coursed hot and wild through his blood, though his vision swam with the shape of Jira's body and the pounding ache of desire, he stood rooted, meeting Drax's glare with iron defiance. And as the crowd pressed closer, as the minutes dragged mercilessly on, something shifted not just in Eric's resolve, but in the hearts of those who watched. The realization dawning that a human, prey by every Xandorian metric, was proving stronger not by teeth or claws, but by refusing to be ruled by hunger. And when at last Drax faltered, sweat pouring, his body trembling as he staggered a step toward Jira before collapsing to one knee, the words forced from him in a growl of shame. "I yield." The entire bar exploded in disbelief. Cheers and uproar. The impossible had happened. The human had won, and as Jira rushed to Eric's side, pride and astonishment blazing in her eyes, he realized that beneath the spectacle, beneath the wagers and the outrage, something fundamental had cracked in this culture's bedrock, and that his victory tonight was not merely survival, but the beginning of something that could upend an entire tradition. The walk back to Jira's apartment after the trial of restraint was charged with a kind of tension Eric couldn't quite name, the adrenaline of victory still burning through his veins, his body aching with the aftershocks of the stimulant, but his hand remained steady as it clasped hers, their silence full of unspoken things, until the doors hissed open to her residential alcove and the fragile illusion of safety wrapped around them again, the hum of her security system greeting them like a familiar friend. Jira, her crimson skin still faintly flushed, moved close, her voice low with both pride and warning. "You've done something no human has ever done. Eric, you've shown them our instincts aren't chains but choices." And though her words sent warmth through him, the soldier in him caught the flicker of unease in her eyes, the knowledge that traditions broken often break back harder. Yet for a few minutes they allowed themselves relief, sinking into each other in the floating curves of her living room couch, lips meeting in the kind of kiss that carried both desire and gratitude. And Eric thought maybe the worst was behind them, until the sharp crack from above split the moment in two, a faint metallic thud against the ceiling, subtle but unmistakable to ears trained in infiltration. And instantly he was on his feet, every nerve alight, hand snapping to the neural disruptor holstered near the doorway, as he muttered, "They're here already." The ceiling panel burst inward a second later, a broad-shouldered Xandorian intruder, crashing down with a guttural roar, weapon glinting, and chaos erupted. Eric shoved Jira behind him, moving with the fluid reflex of long-drilled combat, as he fired the disruptor, point-blank into the alien's chest, the weapon whining as the current dropped the intruder in a convulsion of limbs. But more heavy footfalls outside the door told him it wasn't over, not by a long shot. Jira's security system announced 3 unauthorized biosignatures detected, and Eric cursed under his breath, dragging her toward the bathroom, even as the apartment door shuddered under brute force, crimson hands pounding at it, and when he demanded an exit, she whispered of an emergency evacuation port hidden behind the shower wall, its panel rarely used, but tied to the station's safety overrides. He keyed in his authorization code with shaking fingers, thanking whatever foresight had made him keep such privileges, and the hatch yawned open with a hiss of air. He pushed Jira through first, her eyes wide, but her trust absolute, then slipped in after her, sealing the panel just as the main door splintered inward with a shriek of tearing alloy. The narrow service corridor was dark, its walls tight and humming with the artery-like flow of power conduits. And as they crept along it, Eric laid out the plan in hushed tones. "Divide and conquer. You take the one inside. I'll flank the 2 outside." And she nodded with a dangerous gleam in her silver eyes. Not the frightened woman who'd once brandished a knife in ignorance, but a partner ready to fight for what was hers. They reached the junction where a grated panel looked out into the main hall, and through it, Eric spotted two Xandorians standing guard at her door, massive forms bristling with anticipation, their attention fixed inward, not suspecting prey might circle around. Eric slipped through the grate like a shadow, a neural disruptor humming softly as he moved up behind the first, the strike precise at the base of the neck, dropping the alien without a sound, the second turning too late as Eric slammed the disruptor under his jaw, discharging in a flash of blue light that left the corridor silent save for the echo of the fallen. Inside, a crash reverberated through the thin walls, followed by a distinctly feminine battle cry, and Eric grinned despite himself, sprinting back through the service crawl to find Jira standing triumphant over another unconscious assailant. A heavy crystalline sculpture clutched in her hands like a club, her crimson cheeks flushed with effort, and her hair wild around her face, and the sight filled him with pride that eclipsed the danger. "Told you I knew the advantages," she quipped breathlessly, dropping the makeshift weapon, and he couldn't help but laugh, adrenaline and admiration twining together as he pulled her against him, the two of them standing amidst the wreckage of the intrusion, hearts hammering in sync. Before the heat between them could rise again, the apartment's voice announced that station security had been notified. ETA 8 minutes. And Eric, still keyed up, whispered huskily, 8 minutes is a long time, earning him a wicked smile from Jira that promised passion as potent as any fight. But the soldier in him knew the real truth of what had just happened, that this wasn't an isolated attack, but the first real blow of retaliation from a faction unwilling to let tradition crumble without blood. And as he kissed her fiercely, he also catalogued every vulnerability in her apartment, every exit and blind spot, already preparing for the next battle, because the knife misunderstanding that had once seemed absurd was now eclipsed by a darker reality. They were no longer just lovers navigating cultural differences, but targets in a war between the future and the past, and survival would demand not just laughter and passion, but strategy, discipline, and the willingness to fight together for a bond the galaxy itself seemed eager to test. The summons came at dawn, projected into Jira's apartment by the familiar holographic figure of the three-armed bartender from the crossroads, its voice solemn as it conveyed Drax Vikal's formal invocation of the final challenge, a tradition that, Jira explained in hushed tones, was older than most of the station's founding cultures, a test meant to settle mating disputes once and for all, with the victor claiming permanent rights, and the loser bound either to exile or shame. And though Eric groaned at the absurdity of being drawn yet again into a ritual that felt more gladiatorial than rational, the flicker of fear in Jira's eyes silenced him. This wasn't optional, not if they wanted to end the cycle of challenges that could hound them season after season. So when asked to choose the form of trial, he answered firmly, cunning, and saw the surprise ripple across the bartender's face. For this was not a path most males chose, preferring strength or endurance. Yet Eric had learned enough of Xandorian cycles to know that choosing differently was his only edge. As sunset fell, they walked hand in hand to the central atrium, a vast dome of transparent alloy through which stars blazed like witnesses. The chamber already crowded with dozens of species humans, Xandorians, Aquilians, Draconians, Hesperians, and more drawn to see if the impossible rumor of a human victory and restraint would be repeated or destroyed. Drax stood armored in ceremonial plates, etched with hunting sigils, his burgundy skin darker under the glow of ritual torches, and beside him an elder Xandorian female with an elaborate silver headdress raised her gnarled hands and intoned the law, her voice carrying like thunder. The heart of bonding lies at the center, a trial of cycles and sacrifice, where wisdom outweighs appetite. Claim it and claim permanence. With a gesture, the ground shimmered, walls of light rising in a labyrinth that shifted and groaned like a living thing, a holographic maze constructed from tradition itself. And as the elder declared the contest begun, Drax barreled forward with the force of a storm, muscles propelling him through obstacles, while Eric paused, forcing himself to observe, to breathe, to watch how the walls pulsed not at random but in rhythm, shifting like heartbeats, like tides, like the cyclical traditions Jira had whispered about. Step by careful step, he tested his theory, moving where the walls opened instead of fighting them, turning when the pattern demanded rather than when instinct suggested. And soon he found himself making swifter progress than the brute strength of his rival, who snarled curses each time a wall closed before him, forcing detours. The deeper Eric went, the more the maze tested him. Puzzles of light where two paths looked identical, but only the cyclical one led forward. Platforms that shifted weight back and forth like the beat of a pendulum, requiring patience to cross. Whispers in his head from the stimulant's residual echoes, tempting him to hurry, to seize, to force. But he held steady, soldier's discipline melding with human adaptability, reminding himself that will was more than hunger, that intelligence meant survival. Midway, the labyrinth betrayed its cruelty by forcing both men onto converging paths until they stood opposite one, another across a yawning chasm, at the very center of which hovered the heart of bonding, a crimson orb pulsing with life like a beating heart. The elder's voice echoed across the chamber. The heart may only be claimed through sacrifice, for true mates are forged in what they surrender, not what they take. Drax snarled, reaching for a leap, but the ground quaked, the chasm widening to make brute strength useless. And Eric, panting but focused, called across the void. This isn't about who gets there first. It's about whether we can prove worthy, together. The suggestion rippled through the crowd like blasphemy, but something in the puzzle's logic resonated with his words, for the orb pulsed brighter, waiting. Drax balked, pride and fury warring with dawning comprehension, until Eric said again, softer but firmer, cycles, not lines your people live by it, so prove it now. With a growl, Drax tore a plate of his ceremonial armor free and hurled it into the void. And to the astonishment of all, it hovered, becoming a stepping stone. Eric responded by unfastening his security badge, the emblem of his human authority, and casting it out, watching as another platform appeared, the bridge forming between them piece by piece as they alternated, armor for badge, blade for ring, status for token, sacrifice stacking upon sacrifice, until only a small gap remained. The orb still pulsed just out of reach, and Eric understood the final demand. They had to give up the contest itself. We touch it together, he said, holding out his hand across the gap, and after a long, breathless moment, Drax clasped it wrist to wrist, and as they reached forward in unison, their fingers brushing the orb simultaneously, a blinding surge of light erupted, the maze dissolving into nothing as they stood revealed in the atrium. Side by side, the orb gone, its judgment made. The elder raised her arms, her lined face creased into something resembling awe. The heart has spoken, one mate, one guardian. The human claims her love, the Xandorian claims her lineage. Both have proven worthy. The crowd erupted, a mixture of shock, outrage, and exhilaration, debates sparking before the echoes of her words had faded, and Jira ran forward, her silver hair cascading as she threw herself into Eric's arms, whispering against his ear, "You've changed everything." He believed her, for even Drax, still panting, still scarred by pride, lifted his chin and accepted the clasp of Eric's wrist once more, not as predator to prey, but as rivals transformed, guardians of a bond that had rewritten law. And as the atrium thundered with the noise of 1,000 voices, Eric realized the true weight of his choice, that what had begun with a knife in a kitchen and a misunderstanding about whether humans devoured their mates had become the spark of revolution, a challenge that would ripple through Xander's traditions for generations, with him and Jira at its very heart. The weeks that followed the final challenge carried the weight of history shifting on its hinges. The story of the human who had stood unbroken in restraint and then shared victory in cunning spreading through. Nexus Station like wildfire, carried by gossip, holocausts, and whispers that crossed species lines, until even those who had not seen the contests firsthand spoke of Eric Moran's name with awe or contempt, depending on their allegiance. For Eric himself, life became a strange mixture of mundane routine and extraordinary consequence. Security shifts on the docks, blending into nights where ambassadors requested his presence. Sociologists asked for interviews, and ordinary stationers gave him sidelong looks as though he had grown taller than he was. While at his side, Jira walked with a confidence newly forged, her crimson skin glowing as she explained again and again to those who dared ask why she had chosen him. Not through obligation or conception, but through choice, the one thing most of her people struggled to comprehend. Drax, for his part, surprised them all. He did not vanish into bitter obscurity, but instead claimed his role as guardian with grim pride, shadowing Jira in public, not as rival, but as protector. His massive frame a constant reminder that tradition had not been broken, but reshaped. And though Eric bristled at first, the grudging respect between them grew, solidified one night when a small group of Crimson Fang extremists attempted to corner Jira in the marketplace, and Drax smashed them aside with brutal efficiency, muttering afterward to Eric that though he had lost her heart, he would not allow her life to be threatened by fools clinging to the old ways. The Council of Xandor convened an emergency debate as stories of Eric's triumph reached homeworlds far beyond Nexus. Progressives seizing the moment to argue that if an off-worlder could demonstrate mastery over instincts once thought immutable, then perhaps the post-mating reclamation custom was not biology but dogma, a relic to be cast aside. In chambers lit by fire crystals, elder males argued that to tamper with such traditions was to undermine the foundation of their species. Yet younger voices rose with a fervor that astonished even themselves, inspired by Jira's defiance and Eric's restraint, declaring that the strength of Xandor lay not in hunger but in wisdom, not in dominance but in adaptation. Through it all, Eric and Jira found their own rhythm, carving out a life together in an apartment reinforced with new security protocols. The floating furniture rearranging itself into spaces that suited their habits, his gear piled neatly in one corner, her tools and alien fabrics in another, and in the center, the framed knife she had once threatened him with, now mounted on the wall as a symbol of how close misunderstanding had come to ending what had become the greatest truth in both their lives. Yet the challenges did not end at the chamber doors or the station's polished markets. Whispers of assassination lingered, and Eric's instincts never let him forget that extremists rarely surrendered quietly. So he drilled with his disruptor daily, sparred with Drax under the guise of joint training, and taught Jira tactics she absorbed with startling quickness, her body moving with the fluid precision of someone who refused ever again to be cornered. At night, when exhaustion settled heavy on his bones, he would lie beside her in the soft gravity field of their bed, tracing the silver strands of her hair and marveling at how a life he had thought destined to be spent drifting contract had anchored itself here, in the warmth of someone who had once thought him a predator. The true shock came 3 months later, when a message arrived from Jira's family on Xandor itself. Her father, a stern elder who had lived his entire life within the cycles of tradition, requested to meet the human who had defied appetite with discipline, and to see for himself whether such restraint was truth or myth. And as Jira read the message aloud, her crimson cheeks flushed with both apprehension and hope, Eric realized that their struggle was no longer confined to Nexus Station, but had spilled outward into the very heart of a world that had never before bent. The prospect of meeting her kin, of standing in judgment, not before a crowd of curious aliens, but before the eyes of the culture itself, sent a chill through him. Yet he only smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple as he whispered, "Then let's show them what choice looks like." That night, under the starlit dome of the atrium where their trials had been fought, the two of them stood together, her hand in his, Drax looming silently behind his guardian, and Eric felt the magnitude of what they had begun, their love no longer just personal, but a symbol, a spark that threatened to ignite a fire across Xander's rigid traditions. And as the stars wheeled overhead, alien and eternal, he understood that the greatest battles were not fought with fists or weapons, but with laughter over a breakfast table, with the refusal to yield to fear, with the courage to say, "We choose differently." And though the universe might not yet ready for that truth, he and Jira were ready to live it together through every trial yet to come.